Hi, I'm Matt Zwolinski. I'm an associate professor of philosophy at the University of San Diego, and I'm also co-director of USD's Institute for Law and Philosophy. I work on issues involving exploitation, the concept, and some specific applications like price gouging and sweatshop labor. And I also have interests in classical liberal and contemporary libertarian political theory.
Hi, I'm AnnE Cudd, and I'm a professor of philosophy at the University of Kansas. I'm interested in feminist theory and philosophy of economics and sort of the intersection of those with political philosophy. And I've done work on oppression and recently some work on capitalism. And so I'm excited to talk about exploitation, oppression, and the market with Matt today. So, Matt, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, me too. This should be really great. So we're taking as our point of departure an article that AnnE found in the New York Times recently. It's a fairly short piece, a couple of pages, and hopefully you should see in the text below this video a link to that article. But if not, if you just do a search on Google for wage laws Africa, I found that it's the #1 result. So it might be best if you actually just pause the video at this point and take a few minutes to read the article, and that'll provide a little bit of context for our discussion. So go ahead and pause that now and do your reading, and then we'll be here waiting for you. Okay, you're back. So yeah, let's start talking. Anne, do you want to start us off?
I guess the first question to ask is, are low wages exploitative? What do you think, Matt?
Right, great. So, well, it depends. I think in the case that we're looking at here with this article in South Africa, it's not entirely clear that they're exploitative, but of course, before we can sort of figure that out, we need to figure out what it is we mean by exploitation. So most philosophers who worked on the topic define exploitation today as taking unfair advantage of another person's vulnerability, or taking advantage of another person's vulnerability in a way that is degrading or dehumanizing. There's some Kantian philosophers, or Kantian-inspired philosophers like Ruth Sample who favor that latter interpretation. Both those definitions are a little broader than the classical Marxist definition of exploitation as the extraction of surplus value. But I think they encompass that definition. So to the extent that we think there's something wrong with exploitation of the sort that Marx was interested in, it's because we think that the extraction of surplus value is unfair or degrading in some way. So are low wages exploitative? Well, again, it depends. We could certainly imagine, I think, a case in which paying low wages would be a clear case of exploitation. In a kind of stylized hypothetical example. So, for instance, imagine two people on an island. One person owns or controls all of the resources on that island. The other person controls nothing except perhaps his or her own body. And so, in order to eat and to survive, must sell his or her labor to the owner of everything, and the owner of everything can pay this person just enough to keep them alive, while at the same time enjoying all the material sustenance that the island has to offer. So in that case, that seems to me like it is an example of unfairly taking advantage of this person's vulnerability. You've got them up against the wall, so to speak, and you're taking everything out of that situation that you can.
Can I stop you here and ask a question?
Sure.
And the question is, do you think that the origin of the unfair distribution of this island in any way plays a role in your analysis of exploitation in the matter? That is, if it came about in some fair way, for instance, would that matter for exploitation? Or if it came about in some very unfair way, would that, mean there's even a more serious kind of exploitation going on?
Yeah, good question. I think it matters, right? The way in which these distributions came about matters, morally speaking. It might matter for a kind of theory of justice overall. I'm not convinced, though, that it matters if our purpose is to try to figure out whether the wages are wrongfully exploitative. So I'm kind of convinced by an argument that a guy named Mikhail Waldman has put forward in an article called Exploitation and Injustice, where he basically argues that injustice in the background conditions is irrelevant for determining the existence of exploitation. So I think, right, suppose the background conditions came about unjustly. Well, in that case, I think we'd still want to say that the owner is acting exploitatively in taking advantage of those unjust background conditions in the way that he does for his own advantage and to the detriment of the worker. But I'm not sure we'd say anything different if the background conditions came about justly, right? So I mean, we can think about kind of paradigm instances of exploitation that don't involve any kind of background injustice. So you're driving through a deserted desert and your car breaks down and you're stuck on the side of the road. And I drive by, I'm the only passerby, and offer you a ride out to save your life, but only at the price of $20,000 or some exorbitant sum. There's no injustice in the background condition right there. I mean, it was just an accident that you got stranded in the desert that way. But it's still wrong for me to take advantage of it in that way. So exploitation involves taking unfair advantage of a vulnerability, not so much taking advantage of a unfair vulnerability or a vulnerability that came about in an unfair way.
Okay, well, I think that's useful. So what about in the case that's described in this New York Times article? Here we have some women who were working for a textile factory, and minimum wage was imposed, and that caused the textile factory to shut down. Or I think actually in one case it was the government actually shut the textile factory down because they were not paying the minimum wage. But as it turns out, this minimum wage is higher than the wage that the workers could make doing in other employment in the area. What about this? Do you think that you would want to analyze the wages in this case as exploitative, or do the background conditions somehow make us give a different judgment in this case?
Right. So in this case, the situation differs from the stylized example I just gave in a couple of, obviously, I think, really important respects. One is that in this case, as in most cases of sort of real-world market interactions, we're dealing with a dynamic situation rather than a static one. So, in a kind of hypothetical examples that we philosophers love, you've got sort of this fixed pool of resources. You've got a fixed number of people offering those resources and a fixed number of people demanding them. And the only real question is how to sort of divvy everything up in a fair way. In real world markets, and in the case of South Africa, of course, the situation is precisely not static. Resources enter into that market or exit out of that market all the time, and they do so in response to the kind of incentives that the political and economic and social structures set up. So that's an important fact to bear in mind. There's competition, of course, in South Africa, and no one's going to say it's a perfectly competitive market by the standards of neoclassical economics, but there certainly is some competition there, and the article seems to suggest, at any rate, that the people who own the factories at which these women are employed aren't making a tremendous amount of profit. They're making sort of normal market profits, which suggests, right, that they're not taking, great advantage of the workers in the sense that they're gaining all this share of the social surplus while the workers are only getting a very small fraction. And it also suggests that it might not be possible for the factory owners to pay a higher wage while still remaining competitive in their market. And that's where the sort of the rub comes in, right? I mean, if you want the workers to have more money, if you want them to earn a higher wage, you don't want to destroy the incentive of the company to provide them with that wage, to provide them with a job at all. I mean, the article talks about these women saying that they want a higher wage, but they'd rather have some job than no job, and by preventing employment opportunities below the minimum wage, you block out a class of exchanges. You prevent people from engaging in these kind of interactions that we classify as exploitative, and it's possible that doing so is going to hurt both parties to the exchange, especially the most vulnerable.
Right. So, one question I have about your analysis of exploitation is whether you think that exploitation should be considered always harmful. That is it a moralized concept on your account, or is it, or would you say that there can be some kinds of exploitation which are beneficial, even mutually beneficial, and not wrong?
Right. So I think those are two distinct questions, actually. So, I think I understand exploitation in a moralized way. So for me, the way I understand exploitation is taking unfair advantage of another person. So you've got a moral concept built right into the definition of exploitation, unfairness. So in that sense, exploitation is always a kind of moral wrong, though it might be only a kind of pro tanto wrong. I mean, it might be justifiable in some circumstances. But that's different from asking whether exploitation is always harmful. So I think exploitation is a moralized concept. By the way, and I don't think much really turns on that argument. Alan Wood argued a decade or so ago that exploitation should be understood in a kind of empirical, non-moralized way, and that we get into these confusions if we try to define exploitation on the basis of a moral concept. I don't find that terribly persuasive. I think you could sort of use the language however you want. If you don't think exploitation is a moralized concept, then we need to sort of limit the discussion to wrongful exploitation, and that keeps things clear.
So would you go that way just because you think that the concept in its normal use is as a moralized concept? Is that why you prefer the...
Yeah, well, I mean, in its normal use, sometimes. I mean, the kind of exploitation that we are interested in as philosophers or as political theorists,
right,
that kind of exploitation is moralized, I think. But there is, of course, a non-moralized sense of the term out there in ordinary language. So we can talk about a football coach exploiting her opponent's weakness, and there's no hint of a moral judgment in making that claim. So the debate comes down to whether you think that's a different concept that just happens to share the same word, or whether you think that both the non-moralized and moralized senses of exploitation are really at root the same concept. I don't know that matters. But the other question, though, does get at something quite important, and that's whether exploitation is necessarily harmful. And I think the answer to that is no, it's not, at least not according to the ordinary sense of harm. If we go back to that stylized example that I began with, where you have, not the stylized example, but the desert, driving through the desert example. If I offer you a ride out of the desert that saves your life, for the price of, say, $20, $30, make it $50,000, sure, I'm getting a lot of gain out of that transaction, but I would imagine that the person who takes me up on the offer is gaining even more. They're gaining their continued existence. And presumably they value that continued existence more than they value whatever it is they pay to save their life. So if you judge the transaction compared to the baseline of no transaction at all, right, both parties walk away from it better than they were had no transaction occurred. So in that sense, it's a mutually beneficial exchange. But I do want to say it's also an exchange that's wrongfully exploitative. So you can have wrongful, mutually beneficial exploitation, and then of course I think you can have exploitation that is wrongful and harmful. So if I'm I'm a stockbroker and I prey on the elderly by taking advantage of their ignorance and selling them junk bonds that aren't worth what I lead my clients to believe they're worth. And so as a result, they end up losing a lot of money, and I end up making a lot of money. That, it seems to me, is a kind of exploitation, but it's a harmful kind of exploitation. It's one that benefits one party at the expense of the other.
Okay, well, it seems to me that now we've got a real puzzle when it comes to talking about sweatshop wages, or wages like in this textile firm, which are below what someone might consider to be decent living wages. On the one hand, it seems like it's a mutually beneficial transaction for the employees and for the sweatshop, for them to be employed. On the other hand, it seems that if they're not permitted to be employed in that, well, I guess this is on the same hand, actually. If they're not being permitted to be employed in that sweatshop at those wages, they're actually worse off. And yet, I don't know, do you want to say that they are exploited for getting these wages, or would you want to say that in this case they're not exploited? And depending on which way you go, what do you think would be the criteria on which we would say they're exploited or not exploited?
Right. So it's hard to tell without having more details about the case than this short article gives us. But based on what that article does give us, it doesn't look to me as though the wages are exploitative. Now, whether it does or doesn't, I think depends critically on how we understand unfairness. So if exploitation is taking unfair advantage of somebody else, then the question is whether these wages are constitutive of a sort of unfair advantage taking. And I don't have a sort of hip pocket definition of unfairness that I can just kind of whip out and apply to all the cases that I encounter. I'm not sure really that there is any kind of general definition of unfairness that does the work that a concept of exploitation would need it to do. I think unfairness is a kind of heavily contextual concept, that our intuitions about fairness or unfairness are contextual in a lot of ways that resist any kind of general analysis. But I think there's two kinds of considerations that cut against understanding the wages in this case as wrongfully exploitative. One is that these wages arrive in the context of a competitive, what appears to be a competitive market environment, right? So you've got factory owners who are making a profit off of this labor. You've got presumably stockholders maybe in the factory who are earning some kind of profit off this labor. You've got customers who are benefiting from the factory labor. And the question is whether any of them is reaping any kind of disproportionate or unfair advantage. And it just doesn't look like they are, right? I mean, in a competitive environment, there are pressures that kind of cut against that kind of advantage taking. If you try to take too much advantage of some person's vulnerability, somebody else will come in and try to take slightly less advantage in order to gain that person's business, right? If we go back to the desert example, if you're stranded in the desert and I drive by and try to get you to buy into a rescue for $50,000 and there's another car there, that car is going to offer you a ride out for $40,000. We're going to sort of bid each other down until the cost that we charge you for a rescue is close to the cost of providing that rescue. So there's kind of internal pressures within competitions that cut against the possibility of exploitation. So that's one kind of consideration that I think counts against these wages being construed as exploitatively low. The other is, and maybe this is a little bit more philosophically interesting, the other is this. If we think about global poverty, right, clearly these women workers in South Africa are suffering from severe poverty. They lack adequate means to provide a decent life for themselves and their family, and that's a bad thing. Factory owners who provide them with a job that they are willing to take, even if they'd rather have a better job, are doing something to improve the situation of those women. They're offering them an alternative that is better than any other alternative available to those women, presumptively because, right, if there was a better alternative, they would have taken that instead. So they're doing something to make people who are in desperate need better off. By contrast, the vast majority of us do nothing for these women. We don't provide them with any benefit, right? So there's a bit of a puzzle here if we want to say that the factory owners are acting exploitatively and acting wrongly. The puzzle is, how is it that what they're doing in providing some benefit is worse than what the rest of us do in providing no benefit? Now, maybe it's not. I think, if you sort of go and talk to people and sort of survey their opinions about exploitation, what they think of people who engage in price gouging, or what they think of people who employ sweatshop labor, people think those guys are really, really bad. And then if you ask them, well, what do you think about this person over here who's just sitting at home watching TV while global poverty rages on, they think, well, that might not be great. That person might not be a moral saint, but he's nowhere near as bad as those who actively go out and take advantage of vulnerability. And I think there's something odd about that. I think that's kind of an incoherent set of intuitions. So we need to do something to resolve it. Now, we could resolve it by saying people who sit at home and watch TV and do nothing to relieve global poverty are worse than we thought they are. Or we could resolve it by saying that people who exploitatively hire sweatshop labor, as long as it's a kind of mutually beneficial sort of exploitation, that's maybe not quite as bad as we thought it was. And I'm not entirely sure which of those directions we should go in to resolve the paradox. Maybe it's a little bit of both, but there's at least a paradox there in our moral evaluation of exploitation compared to our moral evaluation of what we might call neglect.
Right. Now, I know some authors have tried to argue that in interacting between, once there's an interaction, then that generates an obligation to make sure that, say, the workers in this case are benefited enough to live decently, so that as long as you're ignorant of, or of people in poverty, you can neglect them without generating any obligation to benefit them at some standard of living. But once you enter into an interaction, then that relationship by itself generates a kind of an obligation. What do you think about that kind of argument?
Yeah, so I've discussed that a little bit in some of the pieces I've written. I'm not persuaded by that claim, though. There's something that pulls on your intuitions about it. So Ruth Sample is one person in her book on exploitation who seems to defend a view like this, something that Alan Wertheimer and I have called the interaction principle, that we sort of owe special obligations to those with whom we interact, such that the mere fact, right, that we're providing a mutually beneficial exchange to which they consent isn't sufficient to render the exchange better than perhaps no exchange at all. I find
and you might kind of draw an analogy with families, say. once you actually have children and you consent to bring them up, then you owe them more than just a minimally decent, beneficial life. You owe them, I presume, something more than that.
Yeah, that's good. That's a nice
life.
example. So, right, we wouldn't blame somebody who chose to have no children at all.
Right.
And in fact, we might think that such a person is behaving better than a person who decides to have a child and provides that child with only a minimally decent life, when in fact they could, do much more for that child, provide that child with a great life. There'd be something weird about a parent who sort of held back on their time and resources and only gave their child the bare moral minimum. They couldn't adequately defend themselves by saying, well, look, I gave them life and it's better than nothing. So yeah, I'm kind of drawn by that intuition in that case. But it's if you apply it to cases of exploitation like those we're talking about, you get some kind of weird results or results that strike me as strange anyways, right? So, I mean, suppose you've got a labor force in a poverty-stricken country where people are desperate for any kind of work, and you've got a company in a thriving country that could outsource production to that poverty-stricken country. But that would only do so if it paid workers in that poverty-stricken country a wage that many would consider to be too low, to be exploitatively low. So that company is sitting there scratching its head and trying to figure out, well, do I want to go in there and provide work to these people at this low wage, or do I want to just keep my production within my wealthy country and provide jobs to people who are already relatively wealthy instead? There's something a little bit odd about saying that it would be wrong for that country to outsource at the exploitatively low wage, but not wrong for it to refrain from outsourcing at all, when outsourcing is better for both parties, right? It's better for the company, obviously. Let's say it lowers their cost of production, and it's a lot better for the workers who are in desperate need of these jobs, right? I mean, that's kind of the thing about mutually beneficial exploitation, is that mutually beneficial exploitation characteristically preys upon, if you want to call it that, extremely vulnerable populations. But what it means to be extremely vulnerable is that you stand in tremendous need of benefit. So anything that blocks potentially mutually beneficial exchanges is harmful to the advantaged party, but it's really, really harmful to the severely disadvantaged party, because they're the ones who really need help. So it would be odd, I think, to say that if you go into that country and start interacting with those people, then the moral stakes go up and you have to pay them this higher wage, higher than, let's say, the wage that might make it profitable for you to employ them. But of course, if you don't want to do that, if you just want to sit at home and do nothing about these people's poverty, well, that would be perfectly fine. It's hard to see what kind of moral consideration could drive a view like that. Clearly, it's not concern for the suffering of those in poverty, because after all, the effect of putting in this principle into practice is to set back the interests of those in poverty.
Right. Well, I'm curious a little bit about why rights have not come into this discussion at all. So, for example, in talking about even the desert car example, would we want to say that the person who's stranded in the desert has a right to a certain amount of Good Samaritan kind of help from someone? And so that's what makes that exchange, while mutually beneficial, still an exploitative one. Or in the case of the company that decides not to employ the workers in a desperately poor place because the workers are demanding too high a wage and they can employ other workers somewhere else at a lower wage. Would we want to say that that's morally okay because the company has a right to locate its factory wherever it wants to locate? do rights come into this, or is that somehow begging the question in your view?
Yeah, I'm not sure it's begging the question in my view. When I first started thinking and writing about exploitation, I actually did uh, describe the concept in terms of rights in kind of just the way you suggested. The reason I moved away from that really is, I guess it seems to me to set the bar unnecessarily high. So to say that exploitation necessarily involves the violations of rights, I think, is to neglect a kind of behavior which falls short of rights violation, but which is nonetheless morally objectionable. So I have a view of rights wherein rights are a kind of, really serious sort of moral claim, a claim that that warrants a kind of social enforcement. And so we might think that there are all kinds of things that a person can do that are nasty and mean and immoral, but that don't quite rise to the level of rights violation. And it may be that a lot of exploitation, I guess I think it is the case that a lot of exploitation is in that level. It's not quite rights violating, but it's still immoral. So, I would tend to analyze the desert example as one in which the victim's rights are not necessarily being violated, but the driver is acting in a morally objectionable way.
Okay. Well, maybe if we could just come back to one more question before we move on to oppression.
Yeah.
And that is the question of whether you think minimum wage laws are an effective way of preventing exploitation. So, do you have a thought about that?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think they're not an effective way in general, and I think especially in the case described in this article here. I mean, the article starts off by talking about government coming in and shutting down factories who are violating the minimum wage, which is just this sort of stark image and disturbing image, right? I mean, you think minimum wage laws are set up presumably to help people obtain the kind of resources that they need to live good lives. And so when you sort of enforce them by shutting down factories who are violating them, you're taking somebody who had a job that was decent, better than anything else they had available to them, and you're sort of putting them in a position where they have no job at all. That's not good. But that's just kind of a particularly stark way, I think, a particularly stark example of the way in which minimum wage laws work. Again, minimum wage laws work by blocking certain kinds of transactions. They say that people are not allowed to engage in labor contracts for less than this particular amount, even if, right, both parties would be better off as a result of entering into those kind of exchanges. So you prevent people from entering into Pareto superior exchanges. And I think, maybe that's okay to do in some circumstances, but Pareto superiority is a pretty good thing. And I think, when you start messing with it, you better have a pretty good reason. So you could tweak it sometimes, right? So, you might perform what Wertheimer calls a strategic intervention and say, look, every mutually beneficial exchange generates a kind of social surplus, right? They're wealth generating, so there's more wealth in the world than there was before that exchange took place. But how that wealth gets divided is a matter of a lot of contingent features like people's bargaining power and so forth. So you might think that
are you still there? I have lost
we can set the minimum wage law in such a way that I think I just lost my connection with Anne here. So let me try to reconnect. This is not.
So Matt, before we were rudely interrupted, you were talking about strategic intervention and how that might work in this case of the minimum wage laws. So you want to start up there?
Sure, that'd be great. So it's technically possible that minimum wage laws can serve the function of redistributing the social surplus created by a mutually beneficial exchange in a way that benefits the vulnerable party more greatly. So, right, if every mutually beneficial exchange creates this social surplus, and the way in which that social surplus is divided depends on a number of these contingent factors like bargaining power and so forth. Minimum wage laws can kind of set the market wage sort of in the area of the cooperative surplus, but to sort of push things so that the worker gets more, and,
Right.
and the employer gets less. So that's a technical possibility. It's a little hard to pull off in practice, though. I mean, if you think about what kind of knowledge, the ability to effectively pull off such a regulation would require of regulators, it starts to look a little bit unrealistic, right? I mean, we don't necessarily know what the cooperative surplus looks like until after an exchange has taken place, until after the agreement's been made. So this knowledge kind of emerges organically out of the market in order to effectively intervene in the market and set the wage at a level which is not going to destroy the incentive for either party to engage in that interaction, which is going to leave it still mutually beneficial, but just tweaks the division of the social surplus. You have to know an awful lot about the conditions of the market, and of course keep up with all the ways in which markets are constantly changing. This is a kind of broad Hayekian concern about the effectiveness of this kind of interaction.
Sure. I'm sure that it is very difficult to figure out exactly where the wage would have to be set in order to keep it still profitable for the textile factories to stay in South Africa and yet pay the workers more. But it certainly seems that there are plenty of companies where CEOs are paid unholy sums of money, and their workers are paid a pittance in developing countries. Why doesn't it make sense for the American buyer to sort of insist, say that maybe Nike pay its workers better as long as Phil Knight is gaining just, as I said, unholy sums of money?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'm not sure how precisely you were speaking there. You said, why doesn't it make sense for the American buyer to insist upon this? And I think, that often does make sense. I mean, there are a lot of cases where consumers have expressed demand for ethically produced products, where that encompasses a lot of different considerations, such as working conditions, environmental concerns, and so forth.
Exactly.
And if consumers are willing to pay for the cost of those, of integrating those kind of ethical concerns into the production process, then I think, that's a great thing. That can spur companies to make changes that they would not otherwise have made. That can, and has, there are a lot of cases where this has been pulled off successfully, improve the lives of workers in some serious ways. The question, I guess, is whether, if consumers don't do that, consumers aren't willing to pay for that extra bit of morality in the production process, whether we should try to inject it in some other kind of way through legal regulation, through sort of industry-wide codes. And there I'm a bit more concerned that the kind of manipulation that we want to pull off is going to be effective and not going to be ultimately harmful to the people that we're trying to help.
Right.
But maybe now is a good time to sort of switch gears a little bit. So just to kind of summarize what we've been talking about so far, we've been focusing on a discrete interaction between a factory owner and an employee of that factory, and we're asking essentially whether the factory owner is doing something wrong in paying the worker what many believe to be a low wage, whether that wage is exploitative, and whether the factory owner should be paying more. And my view is that, at least in this particular kind of case that we've been focusing on, it doesn't make sense to view that wage as exploitative. It doesn't make sense to view the factory owner as acting in a wrongfully exploitative way. But that leaves open the possibility, the very real possibility, I think, that workers are suffering from unfairness, that they're suffering from injustice. It's just that the source of that unfairness or injustice isn't the factory owner, isn't the wage contract. It's something else, perhaps something more structural or systematic in nature. And so that, I think, kind of opens the door for a discussion of some of your work on oppression, which I take as a concept which is more focused on structural holds rather than on discrete interactions. So maybe you could say a little bit about what oppression is and how it relates to social structures.
Right, sure. So I guess what I would like to analyze the situation of the South African factory workers as a situation of longstanding oppression, where the oppression has created the conditions in which the workers end up having few skills, low human capital, and are not able to demand a high wage in the market, and also they just have little market power because they're unable to band together, to create their own firms, to do whatever it would take to earn a higher wage. So I tend to agree with you that the minimum wage laws are unjustified and are only going to harm the vulnerable here. But what my view is that if there is to be a remedy or some way of gradually bringing about a better situation, this more systematic situation of oppression has to be addressed. So, on my view, oppression is a moralized concept. Actually, that's not an unusual view. I think just about anybody would agree that it's that oppression is necessarily wrong. And I think that it entails 4 conditions. First of all, it entails that there is harm happening, so there's the harm condition. Secondly, is what I call a social group condition, and that is that people are oppressed as members of social groups, and that the identity of that social group is independent of the harm that they suffer. That independence aspect is to rule out cases like, say, an airplane goes down and all of the people in the airplane are killed. Well, they're harmed together, but the only sense in which they form a social group is that they happen to be in the airplane that went down together. So it's a social group that has an independent identity. The third condition is what I call the privilege condition, which is that there is another social group that benefits from the harm to the oppressed social group. And finally is a condition, a coercion condition, which is that the harm comes about through some sort of force or coercion, and that may be indirect or direct. So I think of oppression as being created and maintained by various kinds of forces. Often oppression begins with violence, or the threat of violence. So a group of people is kept in check, kept in slavery, or kept in some sort of subordinate position through the threat of violence. Another kind of force is what I call economic force, but economic forces include a wide variety of things that either people do to themselves or that employers or society does to people, including things like discrimination, segregation of the workforce, so labeling certain jobs as available only for men or only for women. And there are other kinds of economic forces, just simple prejudice in hiring would be an economic force. And a third kind of force are the psychological forces. And these forces would include things like humiliating someone or calling them derogatory names, might be much more harmful, even going so far as sort of psychological torture. But they also include forces which, in a sense, are internally generated. So I do think that that oppression is often an internal psychological phenomenon as well as externally applied. So I think that for all of these forces, there are both external and internal aspects. With violence comes trauma, and trauma is a kind of internal force that keeps one from being able to perhaps think coherently, or at least perform well in the market, or perhaps even just to have a happy life. With economic forces like segregation, this is externally applied perhaps, but then could also be internally applied. So perhaps a woman doesn't apply for a certain kind of job because she thinks, oh, that's not a woman's job, that's a man's job, and so she prevents herself from going into that occupation, and that maybe restricts her possible earning power. Or with humiliating and degrading treatment, on the one hand, that could be applied from the outside, from the internal, from the personal perspective. Someone might develop a pervasive sense of inferiority or a sense of shame. Sandra Bartke has written very interesting work on the pervasive sense of shame that women and some minorities feel in our culture. Another important internal internalized force of oppression is stereotype threat, which is a psychological phenomenon that Claude Steele, a psychologist at Stanford, has done a lot of work on. And what he has discovered is that in situations where someone is a known minority in a certain field, and they're the lone minority or one of only a few, in a pressure situation, like, for example, taking a math test and being a woman or a black in such a situation, where it's known that there's a kind of stereotype that women don't do well in math tests or minorities do worse on math tests. This stereotype, when it's brought to the attention of the people taking the test, it indeed seems to have a causal effect where, in fact, they end up doing badly. So this is a kind of internalized form of oppression. So my view is that oppression is both created and then maintained by these kinds of external initially and then internalized forces.
So in the case of South Africa, then, I mean, the most obvious and blatant form of oppression took the form of the apartheid regime enforced by violence, right, as well as various sort of non-violent social and psychological forces. But on your view, though, the end of apartheid doesn't necessarily mean the end of oppression. Is that right?
That's correct. That's correct. So even when legal means of oppressing people end, that doesn't necessarily bring about other externally applied social forms of oppression, for one thing. So, for instance, there might still be segregation in housing that's done perhaps as it was done in the United States, often through real estate agents steering minorities to some areas and whites to other areas. But it also, even if it's not continuing as much externally, it could continue internally. So the effects of oppression, for example, in this case, the case of the women in South Africa, these women were not well educated, and in fact, one of them couldn't read or write, and so there's a case where a previous oppression, previously external force of oppression, is maintained in the ignorance of the person being unable to read or write. But even if that were somehow ameliorated, the internal forces of shame and humiliation might still linger after that.
Now, does
That's
it matter?
not to say that
Does it
one
matter
couldn't.
for your view whether we say that it is oppression that is continuing despite the fact that that the sort of legally and violently enforced segregation has ceased, or whether we say that it's the effects of oppression that continue, right? So is it the oppression is ongoing, or the oppression has stopped, but there's still these kind of lingering effects of oppression that continue on?
Right, right. Well, that's an interesting question. I suppose if all external forces of oppression had been removed and there were an attempt to mitigate the effects of oppression, then you might count that as a situation where oppression is in the process of being overcome. But because I think of oppression as involving all of these interlocking forces, which sort of reinforce each other, I think of all of them as involving oppression. But it seems to me that if a society has taken the steps to work on mitigating it and is gradually moving away from having any people who are suffering from the internal effects, then I would say, yeah, that's a sort of middle case where, it's a transitional case rather, perhaps not oppressive anymore.
Because one of the things that interests me about oppression as a moral concept, and especially the relationship between, say, something like oppression and then something like exploitation, where on the one hand you have a concept which is focused at we might call the macro level, right? Mm-hmm. The sort of social structural level, and you have another concept, exploitation, that's focused on the micro level, discrete transactions. One of the interesting questions to ask about oppression is just how the macro and micro relate. So if you've got an oppressive social context, does that necessarily imply, on your view, that somewhere at the micro level people are acting wrongly, that they're doing something that they shouldn't be doing?
Right. Okay. So that's an interesting way. I didn't expect the question to go in that direction, but I think that is an interesting question about the responsibility for oppression. It could be that we have set up a whole system of institutions which are oppressive in their effect, and yet no one really recognizes that playing their role in those institutions actually continues to recreate the oppressive circumstances. I think it is probably possible for relatively minor forms of oppression to be continued in that way. But it's a further question as to whether people are therefore off the hook and not responsible for their actions. I think that the burden of proof, if you will, or to show that one's not responsible, would be on the person to show that or those who claim to be innocent to show that they didn't recognize the effects of the institution that they were participating in, and that had they recognized those effects, that they would have resisted. Sometimes, however, it's even impossible to change an institution, even if one wants to resist. Right. So I think of John Stuart Mill, for example, when he married Harriet Taylor, he forswore all of the benefits of the oppressive benefits of marriage. So, for example, he said he wouldn't take over her property. Now, legally, he couldn't actually make that a binding contract not to do that, but even so, it couldn't possibly have taken away the effects of oppression, either from her or, of course, more generally from women at large in the society. That is, he was powerless to truly resist the forces of oppression in that case.
Right.
Because nobody would join
Me
with them.
saying I repudiate the benefits that white males receive in our society. I don't want any of them.
Right.
Is not going to be nearly enough, presumably.
Right, because it's not effective also.
Yeah.
Because even if you're able to do so when you're consciously faced with an option you can either refuse or accept, where accepting it would be participating in the oppressive institution. What about all of those cases where you get the benefit of the doubt for being a white male, middle class, well educated, etc. So, for example, if I'm walking down the street at night, or say I'm jogging down the street at night, which I often am. Nobody's going to think that I'm running away from the police.
Yeah, right.
But if I were black, that might happen. So even though I might say I repudiate any advantage from my white skin, there are some things that I can't repudiate. They're beyond my control.
So there's
likewise,
two things, right? Oh, sorry.
Sorry. No, go ahead.
So there's in thinking about the responsibility of agents who live and function within an oppressive system, one thing that might get them off the hook is if they don't know about the ways in which their actions contribute to those oppressive systems. That might work. I think I agree with you that that's probably not going to do much work for the kind of large scale oppressions that you're concerned about. If it was ignorance, it would have to be non-culpable ignorance, right?
Right.
To discharge the responsibility. And I think, much ignorance that exists is precisely culpable. So, another thing that might get them off the hook is that they just can't do anything about it. They just are powerless as an individual to change the oppressive system in any meaningful way. But now there's a kind of third category where we might say that, sure, that the individual could do something to change the oppressive system, but maybe that it would be a kind of unfair burden to place on that individual
Right.
to do what it would be necessary to do to have any kind of real effective change.
Right. No, and that is actually why I think that the oppressed themselves are less culpable for resisting their own oppression, because it places an especially heavy burden on them to resist in some cases. So if a woman wants to say resist the objectification of women, then she should resist the beauty norms that exist in society for women. Doing that might have some pretty heavy penalties for her personally, and so I think that it does get people off the hook if it's an especially unfair burden to resist. But there are other forms of resistance that might be, for example, refusing to go along with, say, a sexist joke or a racist joke or something like that. So there are small forms which are, or at least in many circumstances, are less costly, which I would think that people are morally required to resist oppression, and if they don't, then they're culpable.
Yeah, Iris Marion Young has talked about some of these kinds of issues in her work, where she seems to want to draw this distinction between sort of being responsible in a culpable sense, as in you've acted wrongly as an individual, and being responsible in this kind of broader political sense, where you ought to do something to change the social structures that are sort of causing the ongoing oppression, or the ongoing effects of oppression. So we might say that, for instance, a factory owner in South Africa who's paying low wages to the women he employs, and sort of, I guess, contributing to the sex segregation of the workforce, is contributing to oppression in certain kinds of ways. but we could resist the claim that he's required to pay higher wages or he's required to hire a more diverse workforce. We might say that that's more of a burden than that person should bear qua individual. The way in which that individual should discharge their responsibility is through pursuing political reform instead. Is that something you're sympathetic to?
Actually, I guess I would say that the factory owner, by providing employment, may be, in a sense, discharging some of his obligation to resist oppression right there. That is, if these women are faced with the options of either being nannies, particularly if they have to be nannies for white families, right, or they could earn a higher wage in a factory environment, seems to me that just offering them that opportunity to at least go against the sexist oppression and in part the racist oppression that they face every day is discharging some of his obligation.
No, that's a nice point. I mean, and I think that's maybe one of the cases in which the dynamic rather than the static view of what's going on in this kind of employment is important, right? It's not just divvying up this pie that sort of pre-exists the exchange and deciding who's going to get more and who's going to get less. It's in sort of dividing up the pie, you're contributing to this long-run process, and it might be that the effect of that long-run process is to diminish the conditions of oppression that give rise to the opportunity for exploitation in the first place.
Right. Well, that's the direction I want to take in my work on capitalism. Actually, is to look at least some ways that capitalism can help to break the bonds of tradition that women have suffered under for a long time, and perhaps also bring greater wealth to terribly impoverished places.
Well, that's interesting. So you'd argue then that capitalism is a force, or can be a force, in reducing oppression over time?
Right, absolutely. I think that's been shown historically to be the case, and I optimistically think that it has not run its course yet, and that there are a lot of places where capitalism can be a force for freedom from oppression.
Is that a point? I know you're working on a book on this topic where the focus is on the relationship between feminism and capitalism. Is this kind of attitude towards capitalism something that you think fits well with a feminist outlook?
Well, I do, although it is true that many feminists would disagree with me, including my interlocutor in the book that we're working on, that actually is coming out in January. But I think that feminists basically look at two different ways in which capitalism could be oppressive. One is to say, well, capitalism increases inequality, and I think that is true, but I think that increasing inequality, if it raises the level of the worst off, it could be defended. Of course, that's a very quick statement of the argument that I make, and it takes quite a bit more nuance than that. But basically, that's the direction I had to defend against that feminist critique. And then the other feminist critique that is often put forward is something like a critique of adaptive preferences, that capitalism creates people who tend to objectify everything. They see, so Marx's critique of commodity fetishism, for instance, was that people confused the real value of things for their exchange value, and the relations between people for relations between things, is what he said. And there's a similar critique of capitalism that feminists make when they talk about how capitalism encourages the objectification of women. I tend to think of that objectification of women as being an aspect of the background patriarchy that's exists in any kind of economic system. But that's where I differ from some of my feminist colleagues.
So in other words, capitalism doesn't create the objectification of women. You've got a patriarchal social system that pre-exists capitalism.
Right.
And capitalism may exacerbate, or maybe not, may exacerbate the tendencies that were already there, but it's not the origin of those tendencies.
Right. Now, I'm not sure that it exacerbates it. In fact, I think that if women get independent economic power, then they will be able to overcome the tendency for them to see themselves and for men to see them as objects for the pleasure and use by men. So I think actually capitalism fights against that objectification in a way.
Right. Okay. So now your work on this topic on capitalism, when you talk about capitalism, you're talking about a fairly broad class of social and economic systems, right? I mean, you're not limiting yourself to kind of laissez-faire, libertarian, Nozikian capitalism. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. It's kind of a long story, and I think we're probably coming close to the end of our time. But of course, I'm in favor of a fairly heavily controlled capitalism where government will step in to correct for market imperfections of a wide variety of kinds.
Okay. Well, that sounds very interesting. I'm chomping at the bit to talk about it more, but if you think we should wrap up, then perhaps that would be best. I want to test the patience of our viewers.
That's right. I think that's probably about all they want to hear from Cudd and Zwolinski.
You're probably right. Probably
but
more
this
than
has
they
been great
to
talk to you. And
yeah, I really
appreciate your theories and your questions, and it's been a productive philosophical interchange from my perspective.
Absolutely, this has been great. I look forward to continuing the conversation in other forums.
Sounds good. Okay,
all right.
thanks
Thank
a
you,
lot. Bye-bye.
Bye.